Across the expanse of time, there exists a man whose memory sparks heated debates and diverse opinions. Some exalt him as a prophet who foresaw the changes to come, while others deem him a madman whose ideas lack common sense. Finally, some view him as one of the most dangerous philosophers in the history of humankind. This man was named Friedrich Nietzsche. He was a solitary thinker whose ideas challenged virtually all the established principles of 19th-century European culture. He questioned religion, traditional morality, scientific rationalism, and humanistic ideals. He is the one who coined phrases that are familiar even to those who have never opened his books, such as "God is dead," "That which does not kill us makes us stronger," and the concept of the Übermensch, or Superman. But who was he really? Subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Many more interesting videos await you, and we will continue. Friedrich Nietzsche was a German thinker with a philological education who became a philosopher by vocation and a writer and poet by style. He held a professorship but left academia early due to chronic illnesses. He spent the last 11 years of his life in complete silence, his mind extinguished, though his body continued to exist. However, long before this sad period, he managed to create works that still arouse interest, controversy, are widely quoted, and even inspire fear. Friedrich Nietzsche was born in 1844 in the quiet German village of Röcken, located in Prussia, not far from Leipzig. It was a small settlement surrounded by fields and forests, with a Lutheran church in the center and a measured, orderly life. His family belonged to the clergy. His father, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, was a local pastor, an educated man with musical talent, a calm disposition, and a gift for eloquence. His mother, Franziska, was a deeply religious woman, raised in the strict traditions of discipline, duty, and humility. Their home was dominated by Protestant austerity, a love of order, respect for knowledge, and a constant sense of God's presence. From a very early age, Friedrich grew up under the influence of the Bible. His father read him sacred texts, discussed parables with him, and taught him to pray. Church hymns, bedtime prayers, and conversations about good, sin, and humility were often heard in the house. Friedrich's early years were peaceful and even happy. He adored his father, aspired to be like him, and watched with interest his activities as a pastor. However, at the age of 5, his world suddenly turned upside down. His father began to suffer from severe seizures and loss of vision. The disease progressed very quickly. Doctors suspected it was a neurological disorder, possibly a brain tumor. Within a year, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche died at the age of 36. Just 6 months later, Friedrich's younger brother also died. For a small child, these were events that were impossible to fully comprehend, but impossible to forget. Silent shock, deep sorrow, and a sense of emptiness. All of this had a strong influence on the formation of his character. He became more serious, focused, and withdrawn. From this tragic moment, silence acquired a special meaning for him. He retreated into himself, began to carefully observe the world around him, to remember and to reflect. His inner maturity began to form very early, which set him apart from his peers. After the death of his father, the family moved to the city of Naumburg, where Friedrich's grandmother and aunts lived. They lived modestly, but tried to maintain a high cultural and spiritual level. Now the mother and the female part of the family were in charge of the house. Friedrich grew up in an atmosphere of religious restraint, order, and strict moral principles. He was instilled with respect for work, obedience, and diligence in his studies. He learned to read early, showed an interest in books and music. At school, he immediately demonstrated outstanding abilities. He wrote poetry, played the piano, and was interested in ancient authors. Teachers noted his perseverance, phenomenal memory, and especially the seriousness of his thinking. He wasn't just a good student. He thought outside the box, reasoned more deeply than is usually expected of a teenager. At the same time, he remained reserved and somewhat aloof. He had little need to socialize with his peers, preferring solitude. He would make friends later, but the few who would become his friends would be of enormous importance to him. At 15, Nietzsche entered the prestigious boarding school in Schulpforta, a monastic gymnasium known for its high level of humanities education. There he studied Latin, ancient Greek, and read the works of Plato, Tacitus, and ancient poets. In addition, he immersed himself deeply in the world of music, finding special inspiration in the works of Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven. It was during this period that his interest in philosophy began to take shape, so far only as a simple hobby and not as his own developed system. He continued to write poetry and also recorded his reflections, corresponded, and created short essays. He kept diaries, which he called life notes. Many of the ideas he recorded in them were later developed in his mature philosophical works. However, more and more doubt grew within him. Despite the environment steeped in religiosity, he began to feel that the faith in which he had grown up did not give him genuine support. He increasingly noticed the discrepancy between words and deeds, realizing that religious rituals are not always filled with sincere meaning. His interest in religion gradually shifted to an interest in its origins, in how beliefs are formed, where morality comes from, and how spiritual culture arises. These questions haunted him throughout his life. After graduating from high school, he entered the University of Bonn to study theology and philology. However, he soon became disillusioned. Theology seemed to him dogmatic, boring, and devoid of living thought. He abandoned the study of theology and devoted himself entirely to philology, studying ancient texts, the language and meaning of words. However, Bonn did not become a place where he could fully realize his potential. A year later, he transferred to Leipzig, where he found an intellectual environment that suited him. It was there that he first read the works of Arthur Schopenhauer, which was a real revelation for him. Schopenhauer wrote about will, about suffering, and about the fact that the world is not a well-ordered creation of God, but an arena of inner struggle and absurdity. This corresponded to Nietzsche's inner feelings, which he could not fully express. He realized that the truth can be tragic, and that the task of the philosopher is not to comfort, but to bravely face this truth. After transferring to Leipzig, Nietzsche focused entirely on philology. He studied ancient texts, not just for grammatical nuances, but in order to understand how language reflects a worldview. He was particularly interested in Greek tragedy, not as a literary form, but as an expression of the conflict between life and suffering. He sought to understand the origins of culture, wondering where art comes from and what truth it reveals about humanity. During this time, he experienced a strong internal shock. At the age of 21, he discovered the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer's book, The World as Will and Representation, made a huge impression on Nietzsche. Schopenhauer argued that reality is governed by a blind, irrational will to life, which generates endless suffering. For Nietzsche, this confirmed his own, as yet unformulated, feeling that the world is not harmonious, man is not rational, and suffering is not accidental, but the basis of existence. He wrote that philosophy is not a system, but a way of life, a way of thinking honestly. He abandoned the idea of building an academic career. He began to be interested in topics that are not usually discussed in academia, such as the nature of the tragic, the origins of morality, and the psychological motives of faith. He continued to study antiquity, but now as a philosopher, not as a philologist. In 1869, at the age of 24, he received an offer to take the chair of classical philology at the University of Basel, without the need to defend a dissertation, on the personal recommendation of the famous Professor Ritschl. This appointment was exceptional and caused surprise in scientific circles. Nevertheless, he accepted the offer. Nietzsche obtained Swiss citizenship and moved to Basel. Teaching initially seemed to him an opportunity to live and think freely. His lectures differed from traditional academic courses. He spoke about art, about tragedy, and about man. He did not hide his enthusiasm, he did not simply present knowledge, but reasoned aloud. However, very soon he began to feel out of place. The university expected him to be strict, disciplined, and methodical, and his thoughts increasingly turned to philosophy, psychology, and culture. He felt that teaching was a compromise that suppressed his soul. Meanwhile, his health deteriorated. He began to experience severe headaches, migraines, bouts of vomiting, and vision problems. He spent days in silence, and sometimes in complete darkness. However, his suffering did not prevent him from thinking, but rather became part of his inner work. He wrote that suffering is not a disease, but a way of seeing the world more deeply. During this period, he began work on his first book, entitled The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music. In this work, he combined ancient tragedy, the philosophy of Schopenhauer, and the music of Wagner. He introduced an important distinction for himself between two principles: the Apollonian, a symbol of form, order, and restraint, and the Dionysian, a symbol of chaos, passion, and destruction. He argued that true art is born from the clash of these forces and not from their harmony. Art, according to Nietzsche, does not lead away from suffering, but makes it more bearable and meaningful. The book was published in 1872. The reaction of the academic community was almost hostile. His philologist colleagues considered it unscientific, vague, and too philosophical. He faced criticism for straying from established methodologies, for his association with Wagner, and for his mystical style. This was a painful blow for him. He began to understand that there was no place for him in the university. His way of thinking, his language, and his goals were foreign to the academic world. But he didn't give up. He continued to write, feeling that being understood now wasn't the most important thing. His goal was to express what needed to be said. The publication of The Birth of Tragedy marked the end of his attempts to fit into the existing system. Ahead of him lay a friendship with Wagner, philosophical reflections, and a first attempt to critique morality. But even then, it was clear that he would not become a thinker belonging to any school. He would become a solitary thinker. After leaving the university, Nietzsche found himself in complete intellectual and material isolation. He had no steady income, no home of his own, and no circle of friends he could rely on. His health continued to deteriorate. He suffered from severe migraines, vomiting, partial loss of vision, and severe nervous exhaustion. The medicine of that time could neither accurately diagnose nor, much less, cure his condition. He moved from city to city, trying to find a climate in which the pain would recede, even if only for a short time. His life was structured according to a strict schedule: early rising, a walk, writing, and rest in the dark. Any disruption to the routine led to a worsening of symptoms. He carefully chose boarding houses, avoided social contact, and rarely interacted with other residents. In one of his letters, he wrote, "I live on the edge of silence. Every sound is like a hammer blow to my temple." He even developed a special way of writing, using short and precise phrases that could be formulated in the intervals between attacks of pain. This is how his aphoristic style was born. Against the backdrop of his deteriorating physical condition, he experienced a rupture with Richard Wagner, a man he once called his spiritual brother. Wagner had by that time become a recognized symbol of German culture, a favorite of the authorities, the author of monumental operas, and was surrounded by admirers. But Nietzsche increasingly saw in him what he himself sought to escape: pathos, ideology, and messianism. He believed that Wagner had betrayed the very Dionysian energy that they had once celebrated together. Instead of chaos and liberation, he saw a cult of power, Christian motifs, and the worship of the Germanic spirit. The break occurred not in the form of a scandal, but as a rejection. In his letters, he began to speak of Wagner with detachment. In the book, Human, All Too Human, there were hints directed at his former friend, and in later texts, open irony. He saw in him not an artist, but a preacher. Between them lay not just an aesthetic difference, but a rift in the understanding of culture, freedom, and the meaning of art. Around the same time, he developed a close relationship with another thinker, Paul Rée. Rée was Nietzsche's contemporary, possessed an analytical mind, and supported the ideas of positivism and empirical morality. They spent much time in conversation, comparing their ideas and keeping parallel notes. Against the backdrop of the loss of his former circle around Wagner, Rée became Nietzsche's new intellectual partner. He saw their friendship as a community of future philosophers, free from outdated ways of thinking and religious heritage. But in 1882, an event occurred that shattered this connection as well. Nietzsche met Lou Andreas Salome, a young and energetic woman, an intellectual and writer. She immediately attracted him, not so much with her appearance, but with her intelligence, independence, and bright inner freedom. He saw in her a kindred spirit. That same year, he proposed to her, but she refused. The reasons were complex. He was older than her, suffered from illness, and was a withdrawn person. Besides, she was not seeking marriage, but a spiritual partnership that would not require a union in the everyday sense. The situation was complicated by the fact that Lou Salome began to interact closely with Paul Rée. They spent a lot of time together, traveled, and lived in the same house. For Nietzsche, this was a blow, perhaps even more severe than the break with Wagner. He felt rejected, humiliated, and erased from their lives. His letters from that time are full of tension, irritation, and longing. He broke off relations with both Rée and Salome. He never saw them again. From that moment on, his true isolation began. At the age of 40, he became a man without a home, without a job, without a family, and without permanent friends. He lived sometimes in Turin, sometimes in Sils Maria, sometimes in Nice, in small rented rooms surrounded by books and drafts. Sometimes he didn't speak to people for weeks. Sometimes he didn't even have money for a doctor. He ordered books for himself, edited manuscripts himself, and rewrote letters to publishers himself. He led an almost monastic life, but not for the sake of faith, but for the sake of thought. And it was during this time that he wrote his major works. Cut off from the world, he turned to eternity. His style became sharp and frank. His works, The Gay Science, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, and On the Genealogy of Morality, are not just books, but a cry from the depths of human pain, a thirst for meaning in a world where there is no God, and a search for strength where everything is collapsing. And almost none of his contemporaries heard him. He wrote about the Superman, and he himself was considered a fanatic. He spoke of a revaluation of values, and he was called a destroyer of morality. He tried to talk about the future, but remained in solitude, weakening and increasingly sinking into madness. By the end of 1888, Nietzsche was almost on the brink. He wrote a lot, almost without rest. In a short time, he completed several books at once: Beyond Good and Evil, On the Genealogy of Morality, The Antichrist, Twilight of the Idols, and the essay Ecce Homo. His style became sharper and more confident, as if he was hurrying to say everything that had accumulated in his soul. He felt that no one understood him, but continued to write as if he knew that sooner or later his words would be heard. He lived in Turin, in a cheap room on the 3rd floor. He walked alone a lot, ate almost nothing, and wrote standing at a narrow table. Sometimes he didn't speak to people for weeks. During this time, he began to feel that it was becoming increasingly difficult for him to maintain clarity in his head. He wrote faster and more anxiously, as if everything inside him was boiling. And then there was a sudden breakdown. On the 3rd of January, 1889, Nietzsche went out into the street and saw a coachman brutally beating a horse. He ran to the horse, embraced it around the neck, and fell to the ground. After that, he never spoke coherently again. His mind seemed to switch off. He began to write strange letters, in which he called himself Dionysus, the Crucified One, and Caesar. These letters were received by friends, doctors, and even the emperor. He was taken to a clinic, then transported to Basel, and then to Jena. Doctors couldn't pinpoint what was wrong with him. Back then, they talked about paralysis, syphilis, and brain disorders. Even today, there's no consensus. Perhaps it was a hereditary disease, perhaps a tumor. In any case, after 1889, Nietzsche no longer wrote or communicated. He remained alive, but his personality seemed to fade away. For the next 11 years, he was cared for by his mother, and after her death, by his sister Elizabeth. He lived quietly, almost in complete silence, in a house in Weimar. Sometimes he was photographed, motionless, grey-haired, with a vacant look. He sat in an armchair, looked out the window, or simply into the void. Once, he cried for no reason. Sometimes he would nod quietly if someone spoke to him, but he no longer uttered words. He passed away in August 1900. He was only 55 years old. He departed almost unnoticed. But it was after his death that Nietzsche's second posthumous life began. His sister took over all the concerns about his legacy. She created an archive, began to republish his books, and collect letters and drafts. However, she actively interfered with his texts. She edited them, rearranged paragraphs, and sometimes even added something of her own. She presented Nietzsche not as a solitary thinker, but as almost a prophet of a new Germany. Especially dangerous was the book The Will to Power, which she compiled from drafts and presented as her brother's main work, although Nietzsche never planned to publish it. In the 1930s, his name began to be used by the Nazis. Hitler read Nietzsche, visited his archive, and received books as gifts from Elizabeth. Thus arose the myth that Nietzsche was a philosopher of fascism, a supporter of strength, domination, and anti-Semitism. But in reality, it was the opposite. Nietzsche despised anti-Semites, condemned nationalism, and criticized the church and the state. His Superman is not a military leader, but a person who has overcome fear and dependence on the crowd. After the end of World War II, a reassessment of his work began. Scholars and philosophers began to study the original manuscripts and restore the original texts. It turned out that much had been distorted. Gradually, Nietzsche was once again seen as a deep, solitary, and honest thinker, not as an ideologue of power. In the second half of the 20th century, he became particularly important for philosophy. He was read by Camus, Sartre, Foucault, and Jung. His ideas had an impact on psychology, art, theatre, and film. He became the voice of a person who had lost his footing but continued to search for meaning. Today, Nietzsche is a complex, contradictory, and infinitely important figure. He did not offer easy answers and did not create a complete system. He showed that philosophy can be personal pain and personal truth. He knew that he would not be understood immediately, but believed that he would be understood later. And he was right. The phrase, "God is dead," is one of the most famous and at the same time most misunderstood in the history of philosophy. Many, upon hearing it, perceive it as an aggressive slogan, as a statement by a militant atheist seeking to destroy faith and morality. However, in Nietzsche, this statement has a completely different, deeper, and more tragic meaning. He does not gloat and does not celebrate. He does not claim that God never existed. He says, God no longer plays a central role in the life of modern man. We no longer believe in truth, but continue to live as if we believe. This is the tragedy, not liberation. This idea was first expressed in his book, The Gay Science. In one of the aphorisms, there appears the image of a madman who comes to the marketplace in broad daylight, carrying a lantern, and begins to search for God. People around him laugh, for who looks for God in the middle of the day with a lantern? But the madman says, God is dead, and not just dead, we have killed him. Not someone else, not enemies, and not some external force, but we ourselves, modern people. We killed God because we stopped truly believing in him, but we haven't admitted it. We continue to use words, habits, and moral norms created by a faith that we no longer live by. This isn't mockery, it's a diagnosis. The scene with the madman is also important because it shows how the break occurs. The people around laugh, not understanding what has happened. They haven't realized that the ground has slipped out from under their feet. They continue to walk through the market, buying, selling, and making plans as if nothing has happened. But the madman cries out, "Who will give us the sponge to wipe out the entire horizon? What did we do when we unchained this earth from its sun?" These are metaphors, not just beautiful images. They are an attempt to convey a catastrophe that isn't visible to the eye, but is felt as inner turmoil, a loss of center, and the disappearance of meaning. So, what does the death of God mean in a philosophical sense? First and foremost, it's the disappearance of a higher point of reference. For centuries, God was the source of order, morality, truth, and purpose. He was the guarantor that life had meaning. He stood above humankind, above history, and above time. And even when people suffered, they believed that suffering had significance, that there was a higher justice and a purpose for which it was worth living and dying. The departure of this idea doesn't mean that everything is now permitted. It means that there is no longer an external foundation. One can no longer say, "This is good because God commands it," or "This is true because it's given from above." Everything becomes relative. Everything requires a new justification. Nietzsche isn't happy about this situation. He doesn't say, "Great, we're finally free." On the contrary, he asserts, "Now begins the age of nihilism, an era when old values are destroyed and new ones haven't yet been created, when people no longer know what to rely on, and when familiar ways of life lose meaning. And the most dangerous thing is that most people continue to live as if nothing has happened. They continue to say familiar words, good, evil, truth, and beauty, not understanding that these words no longer have a solid foundation. We use the form, but the content is gone. It's like an empty seed husk, seemingly whole, but there's nothing inside. This transition to a new state requires honesty. Nietzsche believed that it isn't enough to simply reject God. One must recognize that along with him disappears an entire world with its morality, metaphysics, and traditions. One can't simply say, "God is dead," and continue to live as before. That would be self-deception. A true acknowledgement of the death of God is the realization that one is left alone in a world without guarantees, without absolute answers, and without predetermined meanings. This is a very difficult state, which causes anxiety, fear, and sometimes despair. But it's precisely through this, according to Nietzsche, that one must pass to become mature. Modern individuals, in his opinion, have found themselves in a spiritual vacuum. They don't truly believe, but they also can't create something new. They're stuck between two worlds, the old one, which they no longer believe in, and the new one, which doesn't yet exist. Such individuals might seek solace in science, in art, or in politics, but these are just attempts to temporarily fill the void. One might try to return to the old faith, but it no longer revives. One might try to close one's eyes and live by habit, but this will lead to inner disintegration. Nietzsche wrote about this as an illness, spiritual, philosophical, and cultural. He understood that many wouldn't withstand this tension, and that is why he spoke not only of the death of God, but also of the necessity for the emergence of a new type of individual who is capable of living without external support, doesn't expect meaning from God, from society, or from tradition, but creates it oneself and takes responsibility for what one feels, thinks, and does. Nietzsche called such an individual the Übermensch or Overman, but this word is often misunderstood. It isn't about a superman or a ruler, but about someone who has passed through the death of God, hasn't fallen into despair, and has become a source of new values. One of the most complex and important terms in Nietzsche's philosophy is the will to power. This expression is often understood too literally or confused with politics. Sometimes it's interpreted as a call for aggression, domination, and the power of one individual over another. But Nietzsche himself invested this concept with a much deeper meaning. He wasn't talking about power in the state or military sense, but about the inner force of life. The will to power isn't a program of action, not an ideology, and not a political project. It is, according to Nietzsche, the foundation of all living nature, its inner impulse, and what makes life alive. Nietzsche didn't provide a clear philosophical definition of the will to power in any of his works. He reflected on this concept in various books, especially in his later ones, in aphorisms, notes, and drafts. Often, he spoke in hints, images, and fragments. This wasn't because he didn't know what he wanted to say, but because he was trying to express something lying deeper than words, the very movement of life and its elusive source. He felt that it wasn't about an idea that could be expressed by a definition, but about an intuition that could only be shown. So, what did he mean? The will to power is the force underlying all life. It's the desire not just to preserve life, as Darwin and other biologists suggested, but to surpass it, strengthen it, affirm it, and change it. According to Nietzsche, life isn't just survival, but the desire to overcome oneself. Every living being, from a plant to a human, doesn't just want to exist, it strives to become stronger, more resilient, and more free. Even when one gives up the fight and retreats into solitude, this can be an expression of the will to power, if it's their free choice, if they affirm themselves through it rather than hiding from the world. This idea was opposed both to the religious notion of humility and to the scientific notion of the struggle for existence. Nietzsche said that the will to power isn't just a struggle for food or safety, not an animal instinct, but something higher, a striving for form, for meaning, and for overcoming limitations. It's the energy that drives an artist to paint pictures, a thinker to seek new ideas, and individuals to fight with themselves to become better. It's a profound yes to life, even if it's difficult, painful, and tragic. Nietzsche asserted that the will to power isn't something moral. It's neither good nor bad, it simply is. It's like energy or gravity. It's present in everything. The question isn't whether it exists, but how it's expressed. In the weak, it manifests through envy, the desire to obey, and fear, while in the strong, it manifests through creation, freedom, and risk. Nietzsche didn't approve of power for the sake of power and criticized the pursuit of power if it's used to suppress others. He wasn't a supporter of the power of the state or the army, but admired strength that doesn't destroy, but creates. That's why he believed that the will to power could manifest in many different forms. In politics, it's one thing, but its manifestation in culture, art, and philosophy is far more important. True will to power isn't about seizing the external, but managing the internal, not about domination over others, but mastering oneself. Those who have subdued themselves, who have overcome their weakness, fear, and laziness, exhibit the highest form of will. Such individuals don't need to dominate others. They are free because they are strong within. Nietzsche also linked the will to power with creativity. The artist, philosopher, poet, and scientist, all of them, in essence, express their will to power when they create something new. They don't simply repeat what's already known, but shape, affirm, and impose their structure on chaos. They take risks, go against the usual, break the rules, and in this, they demonstrate strength. The will to power, in this sense, is the courage to say yes to life, despite its suffering, meaninglessness, and finiteness. It's the power to create meaning when the former one has collapsed. Nietzsche believed that traditional morality, especially Christian morality, suppresses the will to power. It teaches humility, submission, and sacrifice, condemns pride, strength, and desire. He called this the morality of slaves, not in a social sense, but in a psychological one. It's a morality that grew out of fear, out of powerlessness, and out of the desire to protect oneself. It turns individuals into obedient, submissive, and pleasing to others. But such individuals, according to Nietzsche, cease to be alive. They become a shadow, a function, and a repetition. The will within them goes out, and with it, life itself. Hence his striving for a revaluation of all values. He wasn't seeking to destroy morality for the sake of destruction, but wanted to restore individual strength so that they could learn to live not out of fear, but out of desire, not because they must, but because they want to, so that they could learn to choose, take responsibility, and be themselves, even if it's difficult, so that they could stop fearing strength, both their own and that of others, and learn to distinguish between the strength that oppresses and the strength that creates. Let's continue the story of the Overman, one of the most vivid and at the same time most distorted concepts in the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. It first appears in the book Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where Nietzsche, through the image of a wandering sage, presents his new view of humankind and its possibilities. The Overman isn't a political figure, not a national hero, and not a dictator, but an ideal of inner development, deep personal transformation, and a path that one can walk, but which is never easy. Many mistakenly associate the Overman with the image of Hitler or other authoritarian leaders, especially after Nietzsche's sister Elizabeth distorted his texts, publishing them in the spirit of nationalist propaganda. However, Nietzsche himself despised all forms of mass thinking, fanaticism, and submission. He was categorically against anti-Semitism, militarism, and any attempts to use philosophy as a justification for political violence. His Overman has nothing to do with racial theories or the idea of the domination of one group of people over another. This is not a ruler or a tyrant, but a deeply personal image and an internal ideal. In Nietzsche's view, the Übermensch, or Overman, is the result of self-overcoming, a person who has transcended the usual boundaries of morality, rejected society's imposed values, and created their own. This doesn't mean they simply reject everything outright or live in anarchy. They construct a new internal system, based not on blindly following rules, but on honesty with themselves and fidelity to their own nature. This is a person capable of living without illusions, not hiding behind authorities, not seeking comfort in religion or traditions, but taking full responsibility for their own life. The image of Zarathustra is no accident, as he is a philosopher-prophet speaking in the first person, thinking aloud, doubting, faltering, returning, and moving forward once more. He is not a mentor or a messiah, but a wanderer, searching and experiencing. Through him, Nietzsche shows that the path to the Overman is neither straight nor easy, but a path of solitude, struggle, and constant internal tension. The Overman is not someone who is physically stronger or more intelligent than everyone else, but someone who has found within themselves a source of forward momentum, an internal impulse that doesn't allow them to stop at what has been achieved. This is a kind of artist of life, a person who transforms their existence into a work of art. They do not live according to someone else's script, but create their own purpose, determine for themselves what is good and what is bad. They do not follow truths, but create them, not destroying for the sake of destruction, but building on a new foundation. The connection between the Overman and creativity is particularly important in Nietzsche's philosophy. This is not necessarily an artist in the narrow sense. It could be a philosopher, a poet, a scientist, or even just a person who lives their life consciously and boldly without conforming or pretending. Creativity here is a form of being in which a person expresses their will, their strength, and their uniqueness. The life of the Overman is not imitation or following someone else's rules, but creating their own world in which they live according to their own truth. The idea of the Overman is closely linked to the rejection of traditional morality. Nietzsche believed that the morality that had developed in European culture grew out of fear, weakness, and the desire to subjugate the strong. He called it slave morality. The Overman, on the other hand, creates their own ethics, not guided by guilt or the desire to please. However, Nietzsche does not assert that the Overman already exists. He speaks of it as an ideal, a horizon toward which one can strive. It is a vision of the future, not defined by specific traits, but marked as a possibility. In contrast to this stands the figure of the last man, weary, passive, and indifferent. This is a person for whom comfort and security are paramount. They want neither risk nor suffering nor great goals, but simply live to exist, and in this, for Nietzsche, lies the main threat. Thus, the Overman is not a new form of power, not a utopia, and not a savior, but a symbol of strength, creativity, honesty, and internal freedom. They do not need approval and do not demand power over others, but seek authenticity and are willing to give up everything superfluous for its sake. It is an image of a person who is not afraid to be alone because they find a source of meaning within themselves. Let's continue our discussion about eternal recurrence, one of the most complex yet profoundly personal ideas in Nietzsche's philosophy. It's not merely a philosophical conjecture, a scientific hypothesis, or even a religious concept, but a kind of internal experiment aimed directly at the heart of a person. Nietzsche once wrote that if a demon were to creep up to you in your loneliest solitude and say, "This life, as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it. Could you bear it?" And with this, he posed not an assertion, but a question. The idea of eternal recurrence, in its simplest form, states the following. Everything you are doing now, all the words, thoughts, actions, and events, all of it will return one day, repeated in exact detail, again and again. The same life, down to the smallest details, and not just once, but infinitely. The question is not whether the cosmos is actually structured this way, but what this knowledge does to you. If you knew that everything you do would be repeated countless times, would you live differently? For Nietzsche, this is not a metaphysical theory or a hypothesis about time or the structure of the world. He understood that the universe might be arranged differently, but he was not interested in that. What interested him was how a person reacts to the very thought of repetition. This idea becomes a kind of moral and existential filter. You can ask yourself, if everything in my life, including the most trivial, random, and tedious things, were to repeat again and again, would I want that? Or would I feel horror, boredom, and disgust? And if I wanted the repetition, what in my life makes it worthy of this repetition? Thus, eternal recurrence is not an abstract theory, but a direct test of life's strength. If you live in such a way that you wouldn't want to repeat it all, then you are living beside the point and not to your full potential. If, on the other hand, you can look at your life and say, "Yes, I would live this again," then you are close to what Nietzsche called authentic existence. This is a very personal philosophy because it confronts each person with the question of choice and responsibility. You can no longer say that this day was unimportant and that you could just wait it out, because every action becomes not only part of the current moment, but also part of eternity. The idea of eternal recurrence is closely related to ethics. It does not offer ready-made rules or a system, but a way to think about your own actions. It is an ethics in which there is no external law or higher power, but there is an internal sense of measure and significance. You ask yourself, if I do this again and again, what does it say about me? This gives weight to even the simplest actions and interactions with loved ones, words spoken in haste, career choices and lifestyle. All of this acquires depth. Eternal recurrence illuminates every step, as it were. But it is also an idea about lifestyle. Nietzsche suggests not simply living morally, but living beautifully, freely, and consciously, as if you are painting a picture and you will have to see it again and again. It's a way to transform everyday life into art, the grey into the significant, and the accidental into the meaningful. Such a perspective requires honesty with oneself. The ability to say, I want this life, with all its pain, complexities and surprises. I don't want another, I want this one, but lived to the fullest. There is one more aspect. Eternal recurrence is the opposite of the idea of solace. In Nietzsche's view, there is no afterlife, no reward for suffering, and no eternal peace, but only you and your life and its infinite repetition. This is not harshness, but a challenge. He says, if there is no second chance, how will you live this one? If you know that everything will be repeated, can you live this day as something worthy of repetition? The idea of eternal recurrence is frightening, and that's normal, because it's supposed to be frightening, but it contains tremendous power. It is a philosophy for those who want to awaken. It doesn't give ready-made answers, but throws down a challenge to you. Don't live life as if you have a backup option, but live it as if you are choosing it again and again and again, because only then, according to Nietzsche, do you begin to truly live. Let's continue our discussion about Nietzsche's critique of morality. This is one of the central and poignant themes in his philosophy. He is not interested in what good and evil are in an abstract, universal sense. He asks a much bolder and more uncomfortable question. Who invented these categories? Who benefits from calling certain actions good and others evil? And what lies behind the values that we have come to take for granted? For Nietzsche, morality is not something eternal or objective, but a historical phenomenon and a product of a certain type of feelings, relationships, and interests. It is not given to us initially and not embedded in us by nature or God, but is created, and behind every moral system lies a certain way of seeing the world and feeling oneself in it. Nietzsche distinguishes between two fundamental types of morality: master morality and slave morality. This is not simply a division into the strong and the weak, but refers to two radically different approaches to life and evaluation. Master morality is born out of the fullness of strength and a sense of life's certainty. Good for the bearer of such morality is that which expresses strength, nobility, health, freedom, joy, and initiative. Such a person does not seek approval and does not orient themselves toward external prohibitions, but determines for themselves what is good, and does so not out of selfishness, but out of internal abundance and the ability to act and create. They do not need to humiliate others, but simply live in accordance with their nature. Slave morality, on the other hand, is born out of powerlessness. It is the morality of the weak, wounded, and offended, which arises as a reaction to feelings of oppression, injustice, and fear. But instead of open confrontation, the weak person begins to reevaluate values and turn them inside out. They cannot defeat the strong and declare them evil. They cannot enjoy and call pleasure sin. They suffer and assert that suffering is a virtue. Thus, slave morality is a morality of reevaluation, in which all the values of master morality are devalued and given the opposite sign. What was previously considered a manifestation of strength is now declared evil, while weakness, humility, and self-denial become symbols of good. As an example of slave morality, Nietzsche cites Christian ethics, not because it preaches suffering or sacrifice, but because, in his opinion, it grew out of conditions of oppression and the impossibility of open action, and is an ethics of restraint, not an ethics of action, which asserts that true virtue is the rejection of will, the suppression of desires, and submission. It proclaims that suffering cleanses, that poverty is the path to holiness, and that loving one's enemy is higher than loving oneself. Nietzsche believes that such a system does not reflect truth, but is a form of revenge, the revenge of the weak, who cannot avenge themselves directly and therefore create a system in which they turn out to be morally superior, even though they remain powerless. In his work, On the genealogy of morality, Nietzsche explores how concepts such as conscience, guilt, and duty arose. He demonstrates that these concepts were not initially internal, but were instilled in individuals from the outside through discipline, punishment, and intimidation. Conscience, in his view, is not the voice of divine truth, but the result of redirected aggression. A person who cannot express anger outward turns it inward, and thus guilt arises. It is a form of self-accusation and constant moral tension. Morality, therefore, becomes an instrument not of liberation, but of control, transforming individuals into beings who monitor themselves. But Nietzsche does not merely criticize Christianity or slave morality as a historical phenomenon. He questions the very idea of universal morality. For him, morality is an expression of will. It does not exist independently. Behind every moral system stands an individual, and that individual is either strong or weak, acting from fullness or from fear. Master morality is an expression of strength, the ability to create anew and forge one's own path. Slave morality, on the other hand, is a way of survival through the substitution of concepts, accusations, and condemnation. Nietzsche does not assert that one morality is true and another false, nor does he divide the world into good and bad. He is interested in the very mechanism of the emergence of values, who creates them, who imposes them, and who benefits from them. He wants people to stop blindly following morality and instead begin to ask questions. Who told me this is right? Why do I believe this is good? What is behind this conviction? Is it the voice of my will or the voice of fear to which I submit? Such thinking is uncomfortable and requires courage. Nietzsche calls for radical honesty and the ability to expose not only external lies, but also internal ones. He does not suggest living without morality, but rather creating one's own, not copying someone else's, not borrowing from tradition, but forging it from one's own life. Such an ethic requires not rules, but character, not obedience, but responsibility, and it stems from the strength to be oneself, rather than justifying actions by saying that it is what one must do. Reflecting on the nature of art, Nietzsche, at the very beginning of his philosophical career, turns to a theme that would later become fundamental to his entire thought. In the book, The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music, he puts forward a bold idea. Art is more important than truth, not because truth is unnecessary, but because truth itself can be destructive. The truth about the world, if viewed without embellishment, speaks of chaos, suffering, meaninglessness, and constant destruction. And if a person looks this truth in the face, they risk losing the will to live. It is here, according to Nietzsche, that art enters as a force capable of reconciling individuals with reality, not by deceiving them, but by transforming their perspective. Art does not run away from suffering, but makes it bearable. At the heart of The Birth of Tragedy lie two symbolic principles, the Apollonian and the Dionysian. These are not merely allegories, but archetypal forces that define all art and, in essence, all human existence. Apollo symbolizes light, form, order, clarity, individuality, and image, a world of restraint, measure, and harmony in which individuals see themselves as something whole, separate from everything else. Dionysus, on the contrary, is a symbol of chaos, intoxication, ecstasy, the destruction of boundaries, and merging with nature and other people. This is a state in which individuals lose their separateness and dissolve into the common flow of life, suffering and joy, light and darkness. Nietzsche argues that it was in Greek tragedy that these two principles first merged in genuine unity. Tragedy did not simply tell a story, but gave individuals the opportunity to live through the suffering, horror, and inevitability of fate, along with the characters while remaining art. It did not offer solace or promise salvation, but allowed endurance. Through music, choral singing, mythology, and poetry, Greek tragedy transformed the abyss into form, suffering into beauty, and fate into meaning, and in this, according to Nietzsche, lay its power. It was a way of living without closing one's eyes. Thus arises tragic thinking, which is not pessimism. Pessimism says that the world is terrible and not worth living in, while tragic thinking says that the world may be terrible, but it is still worth living. Even if there is no higher meaning in the world, and even if everything is doomed to destruction, individuals can say yes to life, not because it is good, but because they are strong. They are capable of enduring it and accepting it with all that it contains. And here art once again comes into play, not as a distraction, but as a form of existence. Art does not provide answers, but creates forms through which individuals can feel, think, suffer, and rejoice simultaneously. It is a form in which even the absurd becomes part of the rhythm of life. Nietzsche saw in art a path to overcoming nihilism. Modern culture, in his opinion, has lost its sense of Dionysian fullness. It has become too Apollonian, obsessed with rationality, systems, morality, and science. Everything must be understandable, safe, and predictable, but life is not like that. It contains much fear, chance, the corporeal, and the irrational. Rejecting the Dionysian principle means rejecting the fullness of life. Therefore, Nietzsche seeks to return this principle to culture, not as wild destruction, but as a force that fills individuals with passion, energy, and the ability to create. He criticizes Socrates as the figure with whom the decline of tragic consciousness begins. Socrates, according to Nietzsche, began to teach that everything can be understood and that reason is capable of explaining the world and thereby relieving individuals of suffering. But this is an illusion. Suffering is not explained, it is experienced, and only art provides such a form of experience that does not destroy the personality but strengthens it. In this sense, art is not an escape but a trial. It requires courage because it opens the depth of being, but it also bestows strength because it allows one to endure this depth. Hence Nietzsche's famous thought, "We have art so that we do not die of the truth." This is not a rhetorical phrase, but the essence of his philosophy of life. He did not believe in salvation, did not expect reward after death, and did not build utopias. But he believed that individuals are capable of living despite everything, and art is proof of this ability. It does not deceive or soften reality, but makes it bearable. It gives language for pain, form for chaos, and image for fear, and through this, strength for life. Thus, art in Nietzsche is not something additional to life. It is life itself, understood as a process of becoming form. It is a way of being, despite everything, and a way of saying yes, not because everything is good, but because everything is alive. And the individual who is capable of creating form in the flow of chaos becomes not merely an artist, but becomes strong. This is tragic thinking, not to be saved, not to run away, and not to make excuses, but to be to the end. Nietzsche's influence on 20th century philosophy, psychology, and culture is difficult to overstate. Although his ideas remained in the shadows during his lifetime, and after his illness he could no longer participate in intellectual life, it was in the 20th century that his name became central to a number of the most acute philosophical and cultural currents. But it is important to understand that this influence was not direct or unambiguous. His ideas inspired a wide variety of thinkers, sometimes even those of opposing spirit, and at the same time they were often interpreted quite freely, and sometimes distorted beyond recognition. Let's start with philosophy. One of Nietzsche's most profound interpreters was Martin Heidegger, who believed that Nietzsche completes the era of metaphysics that began with Plato. Heidegger saw in the concept of the will to power not simply a biological or political force, but an expression of the basic feature of Western thinking, the desire to subject being to control, order, and structure. For Heidegger, Nietzsche is important as a thinker who reaches the edge of thought and shows that the familiar philosophical categories such as truth, good, and subject no longer work. In The Will to Power and Eternal Recurrence, he saw signs of a crisis in which philosophy loses its footing and must seek a new language. Heidegger himself followed the path of questioning being, but Nietzsche remained an important stage on this path for him. Another path of perceiving Nietzsche is through the philosophy of the absurd and existentialism. Albert Camus saw in Nietzsche not only a precursor to the rejection of religious meaning, but also an example of a person who does not retreat before this rejection. In the image of the Overman, he saw not a call to power, but a call to freedom and to the ability to live without support, without illusions, and without consolation. His myth of Sisyphus, the hero who rolls the stone uphill again and again, knowing that it is all meaningless, is a tragic answer to the same problem that Nietzsche poses. What to do when there is no meaning? Camus' answer, like Nietzsche's, is live, affirm, not for the sake of a goal, but from the strength of being. Jean-Paul Sartre, with his philosophy of freedom and responsibility, also inherited much from Nietzsche. He developed the idea of individuals as beings who create their own essence and refuse pre-assigned roles, morals, and gods. He said that individuals are doomed to be free because after the death of God, no one will say what is right and what is not. This freedom is frightening, but it also makes individuals human. In this, one hears an echo of the Nietzschean idea. No one will give you meaning. You must create it yourself. However, unlike Nietzsche, Sartre actively intervened in politics and believed that personal freedom should be linked to social responsibility. Nietzsche, on the contrary, looked with disgust at political movements, masses, and ideologies. In the second half of the century, Nietzsche's ideas were particularly evident in the works of Michel Foucault. His approach to history, as a history not of objective progress but of changing regimes of power and knowledge, is largely inspired by the genealogy of morality. Foucault took from Nietzsche the method of autopsy, to show that behind noble words lie interests, and that truth is not only logic, but also discipline, control, and the structure of power. In studies on prisons, madness, and sexuality, Foucault applied precisely the Nietzschean view, to expose not for the purpose of destruction, but to understand how we became who we are and whether there is an opportunity to be different. In the field of psychology, Nietzsche became an important figure long before he was talked about in lectures. Sigmund Freud acknowledged that some of Nietzsche's intuitions anticipated psychoanalysis. This is especially true when it comes to understanding guilt, repressed desires, and the internal conflict between instincts and culture. Nietzsche already presented an image of a person in whom not one single self operates, but a multitude of conflicting forces, including unconscious ones. Although Freud avoided direct references, it can be said that he and Nietzsche were kindred spirits in how they viewed human nature. Carl Gustav Jung, on the other hand, directly addressed Nietzsche. He analyzed Thus Spoke Zarathustra as a profound psychological work, full of archetypal images. He believed that Nietzsche, perhaps unconsciously, was undergoing a process similar to what Jung called individuation, a movement towards wholeness through encountering the shadow, internal contradictions, and transcendent archetypes. For Jung, Nietzsche was not just a philosopher, but a person who had entered into a dialogue with the unconscious. Nietzsche's influence also extended to literature, and he became a philosopher for writers, especially those seeking a language to describe spiritual crises. Thomas Mann, in Dr. Faustus, creates the image of an artist who sells his soul for a great work, echoing the idea of art as a tragic force. Hermann Hesse, in Steppenwolf, depicts inner division, the struggle between instinct and reason. James Joyce and André Gide create characters who seek their own path outside of traditional morality. In music, from Mahler to Berg, in theatre, Artaud and Beckett, And in cinema, especially in the works of Bergman, Fassbinder, and von Trier, echoes of Nietzsche are heard as a motif of loneliness, suffering, and defiance. But alongside this, Nietzsche turned out to be captured by ideologies with which he would never have agreed. His sister, Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, collected his archive after his death, but she did so with a political aim, to turn him into a prophet of German nationalism. She tore phrases out of context, edited manuscripts, and published him as a thinker who anticipated fascism. It was thanks to her that Nietzsche's name ended up alongside Nazism, although he himself despised both German culture, collectivism, and anti-Semitism. He vehemently opposed any form of mass spirit, patriotism, and the cult of power. His entire philosophy was directed against subjugation, but he was turned into an iconography of power. There was also another distortion, a romantic one. In popular culture, Nietzsche became a figure of a suffering genius, a prophet in madness, and a martyr of thought. He was deified as a lonely titan, forgetting that he was not only suffering, but also sharp, sarcastic, and full of burning irony. He was turned into a symbol, behind which the person himself is often not seen, complex, contradictory, and not fitting into any one system. His ideas were tailored to convenient frameworks, sometimes for power, sometimes for sentimentality. Concluding the discussion of Nietzsche, it is important to touch on the criticism he faced both during his lifetime and especially after his death. His philosophy aroused admiration, but no less irritation, fear, and indignation. Some saw him as a prophet of a new era, while others saw him as a dangerous destroyer of all foundations. Many accused him of nihilism, elitism, misogyny, and anti-democracy. To understand how justified these accusations are, it is important to distinguish between what he actually wrote and how he was interpreted. The first accusation is of nihilism. It seems strange at first glance because it was Nietzsche who declared war on nihilism, arguing that the West lives in a state of loss of higher values. He was not the one who destroyed meaning, but the one who showed that meaning was already destroyed. And instead of lamenting or escaping into illusions, he offered a path of overcoming, not to seek ready-made answers, but to create new foundations from within. His famous phrase, "God is dead," is not a celebration of destruction, but a statement of fact. The old system no longer works. Nietzsche understood that the emptiness left after it could be overwhelming. But he did not stop at this point. Instead, he proposed moving forward, towards the Übermensch, towards art, and towards creative power. Another approach is that of elitism. Indeed, Nietzsche despised mediocrity, mass conformity, and the spirit of the crowd. He vehemently opposed democracy, socialism, and equality as ends in themselves. His ideal is a person capable of rising above the general level, creating their own laws, and living according to their own will. He did not believe that all people are equal in potential, nor did he consider it necessary. This causes irritation, especially in the contemporary context. But here, it is important to remember that Nietzsche was not talking about the superiority of some over others for the sake of power, but about the inner height that each person can reach if they are capable. It was a call not to suppression, but to self-overcoming. The accusation of misogyny is also frequently heard. In some aphorisms, he does indeed speak harshly and even disparagingly about women. But these statements, like many in Nietzsche, are full of irony, ambiguity, and sometimes even the grotesque. He wrote as a provocateur, seeking to shake the reader. Moreover, in other places, he spoke of female instinct as more lively and natural than that of men. His problem was not with women, but with the morality that suppresses strength, instinct, and nature, regardless of gender. And although there are images in his text that seem unacceptable today, it is hardly possible to reduce his entire philosophy to misogyny. Nietzsche's anti-democracy is not simply a rejection of a particular political form. He did not accept democracy, not because he was in favor of dictatorship, but because he saw in democratic morality the same slavish logic: leveling, depersonalization, and fear of exclusion. He strove not for power, but for inner freedom, even if it is accessible to few. His criticism of political forms was a continuation of the philosophy of spirit, not a program of state restructuring. And finally, what did Nietzsche offer in response to all this? He did not promise consolation, and he did not defend gentleness, pity, and equality, but he offered strength, not the strength of violence, but the strength of honesty. He proposed replacing the hypocrisy of morality with the right to be oneself, replacing pity with creativity and fear with courage. It was not a philosophy of domination, but a philosophy of defiance. And he did not hide that it was not for everyone, but for those who are ready to think for themselves and live at their own risk. His voice still sounds especially clear.